Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at the new Core i5-11400F as well as a new B560 motherboard. It is the MSI Tomahawk version. And this is a pretty interesting combo, these two, because they are significantly cheaper than the 11600K/Z590 combo that Intel sent out for the day one reviews. And that was a combo that I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about, as it wasn't better than the Ryzen 5 5600X in terms of performance or in terms of value. The Core i5-11600K is priced at $270 US, while a decent Z590 motherboard can be had for around $200 US, resulting in a total cost of $470. The Ryzen 5 5600X, on the other hand, while it might be overpriced at $300 US, you can pair it with a decent B550 board for a total cost of $440, making it not only faster, but also cheaper. And even cheaper again is the previous generation Core i5-10600K for $220 US, and that can be paired with a decent Z490 motherboard for $180, resulting in a total cost of $440. Though I'd argue that $40 more for the Ryzen 5 option is the better deal. That said, I'd actually recommend going with the 10th gen Core i5-10400F for just $155 and stick that on a lower end Z490 motherboard, like the MSI Z490A Pro for example, and that comes out to a total cost of $330 US. So that being the case, the new 11400F might be the go-to option from the new 11th gen Core series. So I bought one to find out. Currently it's retailing for $175 US, so $20 more than the 10th gen model, but it does offer a few new nifty features such as 20 PCI Express 4.0 lanes, faster DDR4 memory support, and USB 3.2 20 gigabits per second support. The B560 motherboards also support memory overclocking, something that wasn't available on B460 boards. Now, the MSI B560 Tomahawk, it's not a cheap board, and there are much cheaper B560 boards to choose from, some costing as little as $100 US, but they are incredibly light on features. It appears as though the more well-equipped boards start at around $180 US, and the Tomahawk currently comes in at $200 US. Now at that point you might think it's best to just buy a Z590 motherboard, and you'd be kind of right. Though be aware, in order to receive the same level of features offered by the B560 Tomahawk, you generally have to spend quite a bit more on the motherboard to take advantage of those extra features. In short, there isn't a single $200 Z590 motherboard that offers what you get with the B560 Tomahawk. It's also worth noting that overclocking is typically deemed as a key advantage of Z-series motherboards, but I feel that's no longer a valuable feature, and that's because K-SKU parts are now clocked so aggressively out of the box that there's basically no overclocking headroom left. And squeezing a few percent more out of them just makes an already hot CPU even hotter. Faster memory can help, but as I mentioned, that's no longer an exclusive feature of the Z-series boards, as the B550 chipset now fully supports memory overclocking. So pairing a premium B560 board like the Tomahawk with a Core i5-11400F will set you back around $375 US, so $45 more than the 10400F/Z490 combo, but the motherboard is better equipped. If you went with a more entry-level option like the MSI B560M Pro VDH Wi-Fi for $140 US, the combo would set you back just $315. So depending on what kind of motherboard features you require, it is possible to snap up an 11400F with a B560 motherboard for a little over $300 US, about the price of a Ryzen 5 5600X. So those are some of the options, and today I want to explore just how competitive the Core i5-11400F and B560 combo is. But before we discuss the system specifications and then jump into the results, let's quickly talk about the 11400F. Like the 11600K, it's a 6-core, 12-thread CPU featuring a 12MB L3 cache. It clocks as high as 4.4 GHz, which is a 10% reduction in turbo frequency when compared to the 11600K, though it's the base clock where we find the biggest difference. Whereas the 11600K clocks no lower than 3.9 GHz, the 11400F can drop down as low as 2.6 GHz, as the TDP has been reduced to 65 watts. That said, this limitation doesn't really apply to our testing, as the MSI B560 Tomahawk runs without the TDP limits in place, as do almost all Z590 motherboards. So rather than manually enforce the power limits, we'll be testing out-of-the-box performance, as that's what you'll see when using this hardware combo. As for the test systems, all have been configured with 32GB of dual-rank, dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory, And for the B560 setup, I'm of course using the MSI B560 Tomahawk. And for the Z590 setup, the Gigabyte Aorus Z590 Master. Then for cooling, the Corsair iQOO H150i has been used, and again, all two systems have been configured with one of these coolers. Though please note, I did try the 11400F with the box cooler, and I'll report those results a bit later on. All test systems were also configured using Corsair RM850X power supplies. And finally, all configurations were tested with a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti for the productivity benchmarks, while all the gaming benchmarks were conducted with the newer GeForce RTX 3090. Okay, let's get into the results. As usual, we'll start with Cinebench R20, and before we talk about these results, I'll just mention that the 11400F ran at an all-core frequency of 4.2 GHz, and this same frequency was achieved on both the MSI B560 Tomahawk and Gigabyte Aorus Z590 Master. In comparison, the 11600K runs at an all-core frequency of 4.6 GHz, so 10% higher than that of the 11400F. Here we're seeing that those frequencies translate into similar performance margins, as here the 11600K was just 9% faster than the 11400F. The 11400F was also 6% faster than the Ryzen 5 3600, and this suggests that the new Intel Core i5 processor will be faster for most of the productivity tasks when compared to the Zen 2 based Ryzen 5 processor. And that's an important step forward for Intel, as the 10400F was quite a bit slower than the R5 3600. When compared to the 10400F, we're looking at a 24% performance uplift for the 11400F, so that is quite an impressive performance improvement there. And here we're seeing that the single core margins are much the same. Here the 11600K was 11% faster than the 11400F, while the new 11th gen Core i5 processor was 25% faster than the 10th gen version, the 10400F. Moving on to 7-zip, and here we see that the 11600K is just 8% faster than the 11400F when comparing the compression performance. That's a great result for the new Core i5 processor, and it meant that it was faster than both the 10600K and R5 3600 while improving upon the 10400F's performance by a 15% margin. The decompression margins relative to the Intel CPUs remain much the same. The 11400F was 8% slower than the 11600K, but 17% faster than the 10400F. It does lose out to the R5 3600 here, and that's a result of AMD's SMT implementation being more efficient for this workload. The AES encryption performance is very strong, and really it's what you'd expect to see based on what we saw with the 11600K. Here the 11400F was 11% slower than the flagship Core i5 processor, placing it ahead of even the 10900K, and that means we're looking at a massive 46% performance uplift over the 10400F. We're looking at a 10% reduction relative to the 11600K for code compilation performance, and while that did make the 11400F slightly slower than the Ryzen 5 3600, it was still faster than the previous generation 10600K and 15% faster than the 10400F. The performance difference between the 11600K and 11400F is virtually non-existent when testing with DaVinci Resolve Studio. Here the locked i5 part was just 3% slower. And again, that meant it wasn't just faster than the previous generation 10400F, but also the 10600K. Premiere Pro tends to leverage the CPU more than Resolve, and as a result the 11400F was 8% slower than the 11600K, but still, given it's something like 35% cheaper, that's a pretty great result for the locked i5. Next up we have Photoshop. Again, very similar margins to what we've seen over and over again now. The 11400F was 7% slower than the 11600K, and here that meant it was faster than not just the 10400F, but also the 10600K, and even the 10700K. The last application that we're going to look at here is Blender, and the 11400F was just 9% slower than the 11600K, and again, that's an impressive result, as it meant the new sub $200 US processor was faster than the previous generation 10600K, and Ryzen 5 3600. The 11400F also reduced total system consumption by 18% when compared to the 11600K, which is a great result given it was just 9% slower in this test. When compared to AMD's latest and greatest, that's not particularly impressive given the 11400F pushed total system usage to the same level as the 5800X, but relative to Intel's own lineup it is quite good. Okay, time for some gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with the Watch Dogs Legion results. Here the 11400F is just 3% slower than the 11600K, making it slightly faster than the 10600K, and just a fraction slower than the Ryzen 5 5600X. We're looking at just a 5% reduction in performance for the 11400F when compared to the 11600K and F1 2020 when comparing the average frame rate, and just a 3% reduction for the 1% low. That said, the newer 11th gen processors actually perform worse than the previous 10th gen parts in this title, so the 11400F came in slightly slower than the 10400F. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, and here we're looking at virtually identical performance between the 11600K and 11400F. The 11400F was 5% faster than the 10th gen version, so not a huge performance increase, but at least it was faster in this title. Again, we're looking at basically identical performance between the 11th gen Core i5 processors, this time in Borderlands 3. That also meant that this time the 11400F was just 3% faster than the 10400F, and given that we're using an RTX 3090 at 1080p, it does go without saying that under more realistic conditions, there will be no difference between these two CPUs. Interestingly, Death Stranding does scale with frequency, and as a result the 11400F was 10% slower than the 11600K. So a reasonably large difference there, but even so the locked 11th gen Core i5 processor was still 7% faster than the previous generation model. And we're back to virtually no performance difference between the 11400F and 11600K with Hitman 2. That said, the 11400F was 8% faster than the 10400F, so a reasonable performance uplift there. The 11400F was 6% slower than the 11600K in Star Wars Squadrons, and that saw it fall behind the Ryzen 5 3600 and 7% behind the 10400F. Like F1 2020, Star Wars Squadrons is another game where the newer 11th gen core processors are actually slower than the 10th gen models. There's very little difference between the two 11th gen Core i5 processors in Sirius Sam 4, and the 11400F was just 5% faster than the 10400F. When compared to the AMD processors, it was 11% faster than the R5 3600, but 15% slower than the R5 5600X. Like Death Stranding, Rainbow Six Siege also scales quite well with frequency, and as a result the 11400F was 10% slower than the 11600K, and disappointingly 9% slower than the 10400F. So this is another game where the 11th gen models are slower than the older 10th gen. And we're back to almost no performance difference in Shadow of the Tomb Raider between the 11600K and 11400F, and that meant the F SKU part was 9% faster than the 10600K and 13% faster than the 10400F. Okay, so here's a look at the 10 game average. Given what we just saw, it probably won't surprise you to learn that on average, the 11400F was just 4.5% slower than the 11600K when testing with an RTX 3090 at 1080p. Also, we're looking at, on average, 10600K like performance, and that meant the 11400F was just 2.5% faster than the 10400F. And this is because, as we saw, there were 3 titles where the newer 11th gen processors were actually slower. Still, it's interesting to note that the 10th gen 10600K was just 2.5% faster than the 10400F, whereas the margin was basically doubled between the 11600K and 11400F. The reason for this is down to the much larger margins seen in Rainbow Six Siege and Death Stranding. For some reason, these games appear more clock sensitive with the 11th gen models than they were with the 10th gen, and this is likely down to architectural differences. Then when compared to the competing AMD parts, the 11400F was 13% faster than the Ryzen 5 3600, but 11% slower than the 5600X, so it basically slots in between the two. Now, just quickly, before wrapping up the testing, a few words about the shiny new box cooler that's, well, it's the old box cooler with a coat of black paint. Although this model features the copper slug, it's still woefully inadequate for use on boards that don't adhere to the TDP limits. Installed on the B560 Tomahawk using the default BIOS configuration, the 11400F peaked at just 52 degrees using the Corsair iCUE H150i. And that's a $220 US cooler that I don't expect anyone to pair with an 11400F. That said, a basic $20 US tower cooler will work well enough. Now the box cooler, that quickly hit 100 degrees, and as a result the CPU started to throttle. Truth be told, this cooler is only designed to handle the 65 watt TDP configuration, and by enforcing the TDP limits, it peaked at 70 degrees, though even here it was still very loud. So my advice is just to ignore the Intel box cooler and budget for an additional $20 US to get yourself a basic tower style cooler. So there you have it. The new Core i5 11400F is typically a teeny tiny bit faster than the 10400F for gaming, but often much faster for productivity tasks with margins as large as 25%, not that uncommon. So for gamers, the 11400F, it's not exactly a crazy good deal. It costs about $20 US more than the 10400F, And well, that is a fairly insignificant cost increase, I guess, and you can pair it with all the same motherboards, so there's no difference there in terms of board pricing. So I feel the upgraded features alone make the premium worth it. Now, for those of you more focused on productivity tasks, the 11400F is a no-brainer. You'd always pick it over the older 10400F and really even the 11600K. In fact, there's basically no point buying the 11600K at $270 US, regardless of the use case. You're faced with paying a 54% premium for at best 11% greater performance, though it's often more like 5%. Even if we include the cost of a quality motherboard, the 11600K/Z590 combo is around 40% more costly, and again, you're not getting anywhere near that kind of performance improvement. And that money would surely be better invested in a better GPU, if you can find one. And it appears as though Intel's been painted into a bit of a corner here. The mounting pressure from AMD has meant that they've had to squeeze every last bit of performance out of their processors, and that's left virtually no overclocking headroom. As a result, in my opinion, most of their lineup is now rather pointless, and their premium K-SKU processors really need not exist. Moreover, with CPU overclocking now somewhat of a pointless endeavor and memory overclocking supported on B-series boards, the Z-series range has also become a bit redundant. Let's be honest here, as it stands right now, Intel is the budget option. They're no longer the performance leaders, not for gaming and certainly not for productivity. For Intel, that's no doubt less than a desirable outcome, but for us, it's certainly not bad news, as they've now been forced to offer parts like the Core i5-11400F and enable memory overclocking on budget motherboards. As it stands right now, the Core i5-11400F on a B560 motherboard should be the go-to option for budget builders. Essentially, you can snag this processor with an entry-level motherboard for less than the cost of the Ryzen 5 5600X. Also, the 11400F is in stock and should be pretty easy to purchase for the foreseeable future. And that's not something we can say about any of AMD's Zen 3 processors. So there you have it. Intel's the new budget king, and the 11400F is the new go-to option for budget builders. What a crazy time we're living in. If you enjoyed this review, please do hit the like button. You can also subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to join the Hardware Unboxed community, then you can do so over at Floatplane or Patreon. The links for both of those are in the video description. You'll get access to our exclusive Discord chat, a monthly live stream with Tim and myself, Q&As, behind the scenes stuff, a lot of cool things there. So yeah, if you're interested, check them out. As I said, links are in the video description. If not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.